Oh, hi! As you can see, I've just finished preparations for movie night. Tonight, me and the girls are watching Sense and Sensibility. Would you like to hear how the book goes? Sense and Sensibility was written by Jane Austen and published in 1811. Like with Pride and Prejudice, part of my summary includes a lot of detail regarding the customs of the time. There have also been many adaptations of Sense and Sensibility, but I don't think there have been as many as Pride and Prejudice as far as I can tell. Both are really remarkable stories, though. The story begins with the passing of Mr. Henry Dashwood. Like I have discussed in the Pride and Prejudice review, in these times the land would go to the next living male heir. In this case, Norland went to Mr. Dashwood's son from a previous marriage. As Mr. Dashwood is dying, he asks his son, John, to give enough money to his stepmother and half-sisters so they can live comfortably. John agrees to do so, but is later convinced by his wife Fanny to give them less money since they're not real family. I should clarify how Fanny convinced him. She basically said that there wouldn't be enough money left for their son Harry. But if you look at the math, John actually does have enough money to support his stepmother and sisters, and still have some left for Harry. This should give you a good idea about John and Fanny's character. Now, Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, are living briefly at Norland, but are planning to find another place to live since they now have no right to live there as John owns the land. During this time, Fanny's brother, Edward Ferrars, comes to stay at Norland for a while. Edward is very kind to the Dashwood sisters and their mother. It also seems Eleanor and Edward may be falling in love. Fanny notices this and mentions that Eleanor is unworthy of Edward since his mother has other plans for his future. That includes marrying a woman of high society. Currently, Eleanor is not of high society. Eventually, Mrs. Dashwood receives a letter from her cousin, Sir John Middleton, who is offering her and her daughters a cottage near his home in Devonshire. They move into their new home and are welcomed greatly by Sir John. He later introduces them all to his wife, Lady Middleton, and his mother-in-law, Mrs. Jennings. Sir John also introduces them to his friend, Colonel Brandon. Now, Colonel Brandon seems to be in love with Marianne, and Mrs. Jennings jokes about it. Marianne doesn't see herself falling for Colonel Brandon due to his age, 35, and her belief that he is not capable of falling in love. Now, one day, Marianne is out for a walk and it starts raining heavily. Marianne tries to make her way home, but she slips and sprains her ankle. A man named John Willoughby sees the accident and takes her home. Willoughby visits frequently to see if Marianne is well, and as they get to know each other, Marianne starts to fall in love. Over time, Eleanor and Mrs. Dashwood begin to suspect that Willoughby and Marianne are secretly engaged. This is further proven by Willoughby taking Marianne to his home without a chaperone, and him taking a lock of Marianne's hair. However, one day, Willoughby tells the Dashwoods that his aunt, Mrs. Smith, is sending him away to London on business. Now, Willoughby relies on Mrs. Smith financially, so he can't refuse her. Marianne is upset that she will not see him again for a long time. Edward comes by for a visit later on, but he doesn't seem very happy. Eleanor fears that he may no longer have feelings for her. After Edward leaves, Mrs. Jennings' cousins, Anne and Lucy Steele, come to stay at Barton Park for a while. As they get to know each other, Lucy informs Eleanor that she has been engaged to Edward for 4 years, which started while he was studying with her uncle, Mr. Pratt, at Plymouth. Lucy swears Eleanor to secrecy, as the only other person who knows is Anne, her sister. Eleanor notices through Lucy's behavior that she might be jealous of her and that it's likely Edward no longer loves Lucy, but can't bring himself to break the engagement. A while later, Eleanor and Marianne accompany Mrs. Jennings to London. Marianne writes a few letters to Willoughby, but they go unanswered. Later at a dance, Marianne and Willoughby meet again. This time, Willoughby is accompanied by a lady named Sophia Grey. Now, Willoughby treats Marianne coldly, and this shocks Marianne to the point where Eleanor has to nearly carry Marianne home. Marianne receives a letter from Willoughby soon after, containing all of her letters sent to him and the lock of her hair. Marianne also learns that Willoughby is engaged to Miss Grey. She is devastated. Marianne confesses to Eleanor that they were never actually engaged. Her behavior toward Willoughby was because she loved him and she believed that he loved her as well. Sometime later, Colonel Brandon pays a visit and tells Eleanor about his young ward, Miss Eliza Williams. Now, Miss Williams is the daughter of Colonel Brandon's former love, who was also named Eliza. Eliza was unhappily married to Colonel Brandon's older brother, who she later divorced while Brandon was in the army. While Colonel Brandon returned, he eventually found her dying in a poorhouse. When Eliza passed away, Colonel Brandon took it upon himself to watch over her daughter. Anyway, not too long ago, Colonel Brandon had heard that Miss Williams disappeared, and he got word that she had been found when he was about to go on an outing with the Dashwoods and the Middletons. It was there that he found out that Miss Williams was with child and that the father was Willoughby. Mrs. Smith heard about this and disowned Willoughby. Because of Willoughby's many debts, he chose to marry Miss Grey for her money. Now, Colonel Brandon moved Miss Williams and her child to a home in the country. He came to tell Eleanor so she can tell Marianne of Willoughby's true character. Colonel Brandon starts to visit more often at this point, and Marianne is now allowing herself to get to know him. Now, later on, the Steele sisters come by for a visit around the same time as John and Fanny Dashwood. Fanny offers an invitation to the Steeles to stay in their London house. Also, Fanny's mother, Mrs. Ferrars, comes to visit and is rather cold to Eleanor while very polite to Lucy. While the Steeles are staying with the Dashwoods, Anne seems to believe that since Fanny and Mrs. Ferrars have been so kind to Lucy, they will accept her as part of the family. So, Anne tells Fanny of Lucy's engagement to Edward. Well, that was the worst idea she could have had. Fanny throws Lucy and Anne out of her house, and Mrs. Ferrars insists that Edward break off his engagement with Lucy. Edward refuses, since a broken engagement would reflect poorly on Lucy since she doesn't have any money. Mrs. Ferrars disowns Edward, and now the inheritance will go to his younger brother, Robert. Colonel Brandon hears about all of this and offers Edward a small parsonage near his property, which had just recently been vacated. This will allow him to marry Lucy and give them a roof over their heads after he is ordained, for Edward did mention that his interests were more in the church. During this time, Eleanor confesses to Marianne that she knew of Lucy's engagement to Edward, and Marianne feels terrible for not understanding her suffering. Mrs. Jennings later takes Eleanor and Marianne to the country to visit her other daughter, Charlotte Palmer, and her family. Cleveland isn't too far away from where Willoughby lives, and Marianne, still distraught at Willoughby's marrying Miss Grey, walks over frequently to see it. After one walk in the rain, she becomes ill. It's soon discovered that she has putrid fever, which is a highly contagious disease, so Mrs. Palmer has to leave with her husband and new baby to stay elsewhere until Marianne gets better. Mrs. Jennings and Eleanor stay behind. Eleanor writes to her mother that Marianne might die soon, and Colonel Brandon leaves to bring Mrs. Dashwood over to the estate. One night, Willoughby stops by since he heard that Marianne is dying. Eleanor at first wants nothing to do with him, but agrees to hear him out. Willoughby is in love with Marianne, and he has been miserable ever since losing her. He reveals that Mrs. Smith would have forgiven him if he married Miss Williams, but he refused. Willoughby later leaves, begging Eleanor to tell all of this to Marianne. Eleanor does pity him slightly, but is disgusted by the way he talks about Miss Williams, their son, and his own wife. Marianne eventually recovers after Mrs. Dashwood arrives. Eleanor tells Marianne what Willoughby told her, and after some thinking, Marianne realizes that she never would have been happy with Willoughby. After returning home to the cottage, Edward soon pays them a visit. Now, they had just gotten word that Edward had recently married Lucy. When asked about Lucy, Edward reveals that he is not the one who married Lucy. After Edward's disinheritance, Lucy left Edward and married Robert. Edward reveals his real reason for visiting the Dashwood girls is to ask Eleanor to marry him. She accepts. Now, 2 years later, Marianne later marries Colonel Brandon. The two couples live happily as neighbors. Now, this last part is interesting, as the narrator mentions Willoughby. It's normal to expect something awful to happen to him, but in reality, the narrator admits that while Willoughby was in love with Marianne, don't suppose that Willoughby was never happy again. Alright, let's analyze. First, the big one. Let's compare the two sisters. Eleanor has a habit of hiding her emotions so that she can keep up a good appearance. Meanwhile, Marianne lets her emotions take over. Everyone knows what she's feeling. The problem with this is that people view her differently. Marianne is very specific on how she wants her married life to look, while Eleanor would simply be happy to have a loving husband and a roof over her head. Also, look at the reactions they had when they found out they couldn't have the man they want to be with. Marianne was devastated when she found out Willoughby married another, and everyone knew about it from looking at her. When Eleanor found out about Edward being engaged to Lucy Steele, she kept it to herself so that she could keep up appearances and look at everything from a logical point of view. However, as we all know, holding in emotions like that is not healthy. Eventually, Eleanor did let her emotions out, and Marianne felt terrible that Eleanor suffered so much, while Marianne was complaining that no one knew what she was going through. There was also another time when Eleanor let her emotions out, and that was when Edward said that he was no longer engaged to Lucy Steele, and had come to marry Eleanor. It's clear throughout the story that both sisters have feelings, they just express them in their own way. Eleanor, being the eldest, wants to make sure she is respectable, while Marianne only cares about her own happiness for a while. In the end, it's likely Eleanor learned to communicate her feelings better, and Marianne learned to be more reserved with her emotions. Let's look at Edward for a moment. He expresses really early on that his mother has his whole life planned out for him, but he doesn't want it. His mother wants him to go into law while he only wishes to be a clergyman. When he eventually is confronted with making his own choice, he takes it. While he did lose a lot of his money, he had the freedom to do what he wanted. In the end, Mrs. Ferrers actually did end up treating Edward like a son again, since she wanted nothing to do with Robert after he married Lucy. Now, I also want to look at Colonel Brandon and Willoughby for a moment. While Willoughby did love Marianne, he chose money and well-being over her. He also made horrible decisions that got him into trouble. Meanwhile, Colonel Brandon treated Marianne and her family with respect. While he did love Marianne, he understood that she was happy with Willoughby while they were together. He only wanted her to be happy. However, he also cared about her safety, since he told Eleanor of Willoughby's true character, as he feared Willoughby may have planned to hurt her as he had hurt Miss Williams. This helps the reader understand why Marianne chose Colonel Brandon in the end, even after Willoughby tried to clear things up. I didn't talk much about John Dashwood and Fanny, but like I said, from the beginning, you can tell that Fanny hates her in-laws since they're not really high society, and John is a pushover who will do anything to please his wife. In fact, John justifies not giving the girls much money by believing that the girls will marry a rich man. While it is true that Eleanor and Marianne, and eventually Margaret, married well, what would happen if they didn't? What would happen if they didn't have anywhere to live? What then? Something to think about. Overall, I still enjoy the story. It's a fun time and the ending is amazing. I would recommend this for ages 16 and up, since like Pride and Prejudice, the language is difficult to understand and there is a lot of talk of property, money, and marriage. Now, that was the custom of the time, and was very important to families back then due to the laws of the time. But still, I can understand that some younger readers might get a little bored and confused reading all that. The book has been adapted a few times. I've seen the 1995 theatrical release and I enjoy it immensely. I actually recommend giving it a watch. It's fun and keeps you engaged the whole time. I'm glad I got to read this book again after so long. It's just as great as I remember it being, and I hope each of you get a chance to read it too. Happy reading!